They say money reveals who people really are. But sometimes, it's not the money itself that exposes the truth. It's what happens when someone thinks they've gotten it all, and you've gotten nothing. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and the day my brother Daniel laughed at my $1 inheritance was the same day I learned that the people who claim to love you the most can be the ones who understand you the least. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that sometimes the smallest gift carries the biggest secret. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I was 42 years old when our father, Robert Mitchell, was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's at the age of 68. The news came on a Tuesday morning in September, delivered by Dr. Harrison in a sterile office that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. Dad sat in the chair beside me, his weathered hands folded in his lap, nodding as if he understood every word. But I could see the confusion creeping into his eyes like fog rolling over the hills of our hometown in Millbrook, Connecticut. Daniel wasn't there. He was never there for the appointments, the consultations, or the difficult conversations that followed. My older brother lived in Manhattan, working as a corporate lawyer for one of those firms where the marble lobby costs more than most people's houses. He had a corner office on the 37th floor, a wife named Victoria who wore designer suits like armor, and twin boys who attended private school and spoke French better than I spoke confidence. When I called Daniel that evening to tell him about Dad's diagnosis, I could hear the sounds of his life in the background. Expensive cutlery against fine china, Victoria's laugh like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, the boys practicing violin, classical music. Everything in Daniel's world was orchestrated, refined, purposeful. "Sarah," he said, and I could picture him loosening his silk tie, already calculating how this news would fit into his carefully planned existence. "This is terrible, of course. But you know Dad's always been forgetful. Are we sure it's not just aging?" I pressed the phone closer to my ear, standing in the kitchen of the small ranch house I'd bought 3 blocks from our childhood home. Through the window, I could see Dad in his garden, still tending to the tomatoes he'd planted every spring for as long as I could remember. His movements were slower now, more deliberate, but his hands still knew the soil. "The doctor ran extensive tests, Daniel. It's Alzheimer's, early onset. He has maybe 5 good years left, maybe less." There was a pause. I heard him excuse himself from dinner, his footsteps echoing across hardwood floors. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, we'll figure this out. There are facilities, excellent ones. I can research the best options. Money isn't an issue." Money. That was always Daniel's first solution. His answer to every problem that couldn't be argued away in a courtroom. Write a check, hire the best, delegate the difficulty. It was a privilege I'd never had, and, honestly, had never wanted. "He doesn't want a facility, Daniel. Not yet. He wants to stay in his house, in his garden. He wants to remain himself for as long as possible." "Sarah, be realistic. You can't possibly—" "I'm taking a leave of absence from work," I interrupted. I taught 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary, had been there for 18 years. The principal, Mrs. Chen, had already agreed to hold my position. The kids would miss me, and I would miss them, but some things mattered more than lesson plans and parent conferences. Daniel's sigh was heavy, filled with the weight of someone who believed he understood the world better than everyone else. "You're throwing your life away. Dad wouldn't want that." But that's where my brother was wrong. Dad would want exactly that, because Dad had done exactly that for his own father 25 years earlier. When Grandpa Mitchell had his stroke, Dad had taken early retirement from the electric company, sold his fishing boat, and spent 3 years learning how to be a caregiver. He never complained, never made it seem like a sacrifice. He just did what needed to be done, because that's what you do for family. Daniel had been in law school then, too busy with moot court competitions and summer internships to help. I was fresh out of college, just starting my teaching career, but I came home every weekend. I learned to cook Grandpa's favorite meals, helped Dad with the physical therapy exercises, read aloud from the newspapers because Grandpa's eyesight was failing. After Grandpa passed, Dad never said much about those 3 years. He just went back to work part-time, rebuilt his life quietly, and never once mentioned what he'd given up. But I knew. I saw how his hands had aged, how his back had curved from lifting and bending, how his eyes held a sadness that comes from watching someone you love disappear piece by piece. Now it was my turn. I moved back into my childhood bedroom that October. The wallpaper was the same pale yellow I'd picked out when I was 12, with tiny daisies scattered across it like memories. Dad protested at first, said he didn't need a babysitter, that I was being ridiculous. But when I found him standing in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, fully dressed and confused about why the coffee pot wasn't working, we both knew I'd made the right choice. The early days weren't so bad. Dad still remembered most things, still told his stories about working for Connecticut Light and Power, still tended his garden with the patience of someone who understood that good things take time. We developed routines. Morning coffee at the kitchen table while we planned the day. Afternoon walks around the neighborhood where he'd lived for 40 years. Evening news with a dinner I'd learned to cook from Mom's old recipe cards. Mom. Patricia Mitchell had died of breast cancer when I was 28 and Daniel was 31. She'd fought for 2 years, and during those 2 years, I'd driven from my apartment in Hartford to Millbrook every Tuesday and Thursday for chemo appointments. Daniel visited when he could, usually bringing expensive flowers and staying just long enough to feel like he'd done his part. The difference was, Mom had been sick. We could see the enemy, could fight it with medicine and hope, and stubborn determination. Alzheimer's was different. It was a thief that came in the night, stealing pieces of the person you loved until you were left holding conversations with a stranger who wore your father's face. By the second year, Dad started forgetting names. First, neighbors he'd known for decades, then distant relatives, then sometimes mine. The first time he called me Patricia, I excused myself to the bathroom and cried silently for 10 minutes. When I came back out, he was watering the plants on the windowsill, humming an old song I remembered from childhood. Daniel visited twice that year, once for Dad's birthday, bringing an expensive watch that Dad immediately forgot he'd received. Once for Christmas, with Victoria and the boys, turning our simple celebration into an awkward performance where everyone pretended everything was normal while Dad asked the same questions over and over. "How's Sarah doing?" Dad would ask Daniel during that Christmas visit. "She's right here, Dad," Daniel would say, patience wearing thin. "She's taking care of you." "Oh," Dad would nod, smile at me like we'd just met. "You're very kind to help out." After they left, I found Daniel in the driveway, loading presents into his BMW. His jaw was tight, his movement sharp with frustration. "This is impossible, Sarah. He doesn't even know who you are half the time. What's the point?" I thought about explaining that the point wasn't recognition. The point was presence. The point was that when Dad woke up frightened in the middle of the night, there was someone there to remind him he was safe. When he couldn't remember how to work the television remote, there was someone patient enough to show him again and again. When he stood in the garden, confused about why the tomatoes wouldn't grow in December, there was someone who could gently redirect him to the seed catalogs, helping him plan for spring. But I didn't explain any of that to Daniel. I just said, someone has to. The third year was harder. Dad stopped recognizing the house as his own, would pack bags and insist he needed to go home. He'd wander at night, looking for his parents who'd been dead for 30 years. He'd have conversations with Mom, setting 2 places for dinner, and waiting for her to come down from upstairs. I quit teaching permanently that year. The leave of absence had stretched as long as it could, and Mrs. Chen, kind as she was, needed to hire someone permanent. I took a part-time job at the library instead, working mornings when Dad was most lucid, arranging for Mrs. Rodriguez from next door to check on him. The money was tight. My savings dwindled. The house needed repairs I couldn't afford. But Daniel's solution was always the same. "Just put him in a facility. I'll pay for the best one." He didn't understand that it wasn't about money. It was about dignity. It was about letting Dad spend his last coherent moments in the garden he'd built, surrounded by the photographs of Mom that still lined the hallway, sleeping in the bed where he'd dreamed beside her for 35 years. By the 4th year, Dad barely spoke. He'd sit in his chair by the window, watching the birds at the feeder he no longer remembered filling. Sometimes he'd smile at me when I brought him lunch, a sweet, childlike smile that broke my heart every single time. Other times, he'd look at me with suspicion, as if I were an intruder in his home. Daniel's visits became even less frequent. "It's too hard on the boys," Victoria would say when I called to ask about Christmas plans. "They don't understand why Grandpa doesn't remember them." The truth was, it was too hard on Daniel. He couldn't bear to see the man who'd taught him to throw a curveball, who'd helped him with calculus homework, who'd worn a tuxedo to his wedding despite hating formal clothes, reduced to someone who needed help remembering how to use a fork. But I stayed. I learned to communicate without words, to read the language of his gestures and expressions. I celebrated small victories. A morning when he remembered my name, an afternoon when he hummed along to a song on the radio, an evening when he looked at Mom's photograph and whispered, "Beautiful Patty." I stayed because leaving would have meant abandoning not just Dad but the man he used to be. I stayed because someone had to witness his story, even as it was ending. I stayed because love isn't just about the good times, the easy times, the times when recognition flows both ways. I stayed because that's what daughters do. At least, that's what this daughter did. The phone calls from Daniel during this period were brief, practical, focused on logistics. How are his medications working? Have you considered hiring more help? Is the house holding up okay? Never, how are you holding up? Never, what do you need? Never, I'm proud of what you're doing. When Dad passed away on a quiet Thursday morning in March, 5 years after his diagnosis, I was holding his hand, just like I'd held it through thousands of difficult moments. His breathing had grown shallow during the night, and I'd known it was time. I'd played his favorite Glenn Miller recordings softly on the old stereo, opened the window so he could hear the birds he'd fed every morning for decades. Daniel arrived 2 hours after I called him. He stood in the doorway of Dad's bedroom, still wearing his expensive suit, and I watched him try to process what he was seeing. Our father looked peaceful, smaller somehow, but peaceful. "I should have been here," he said quietly. "You're here now," I replied, though we both knew it wasn't the same thing. The funeral was simple, the way Dad would have wanted it. The church was full of neighbors, former co-workers, people whose lives he'd touched in small but meaningful ways. Daniel gave a polished eulogy about Dad's integrity and work ethic. I shared a memory about how Dad used to let me help in the garden, teaching me that the best flowers come from the most patient tending. After the service, after the burial, after the last casserole dish had been returned and the last sympathy card had been read, Daniel and I sat in Dad's kitchen, surrounded by the silence that follows the end of something significant. "The lawyer wants to meet with us next week," Daniel said, loosening his black tie, "to go over the will." I nodded, too exhausted to think about wills or inheritances or anything beyond the immediate task of figuring out how to live in a world without the man who taught me what it meant to stay when staying was hard. What I didn't know then was that Dad had been watching, remembering, and planning, even as his mind was failing him. What I didn't know was that the man who sometimes forgot my name had never forgotten what I'd sacrificed for him. What I didn't know was that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the smallest packages, and that my brother's laughter at the will reading would be the sound that finally set me free. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The law office of Pemberton and Associates sat on Main Street like a monument to old money and older secrets. Built in 1924, the red brick building had weathered nearly a century of Millbrook's quiet dramas, divorce settlements, property disputes, and the final wishes of families who'd lived and died within walking distance of each other. I'd passed it countless times during my walks with Dad, but I'd never imagined I'd be sitting in its mahogany-paneled waiting room, smoothing my black dress and wondering why my palms were sweating. It had been a week since the funeral, a week of sorting through Dad's belongings, fielding calls from well-meaning neighbors, and trying to figure out what came next. The house felt enormous and impossibly small at the same time, every room echoing with memories, every corner holding reminders of the man who'd filled these spaces with his gentle presence for so many decades. Daniel had driven up from the city that morning, his silver BMW looking out of place among the modest sedans and pickup trucks that usually lined our street. He'd knocked on the front door at exactly 9:30, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than I made in a month at the library. Victoria hadn't come. "The boys have soccer practice," he'd explained, though we both knew that wasn't the real reason. "You look tired," he said, as I grabbed my purse and the folder of documents I'd been asked to bring. I was tired. Bone deep, soul tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. 5 years of hypervigilance, of listening for Dad's footsteps in the night, of monitoring every change in his condition, of being constantly alert to signs of confusion or distress. It doesn't just disappear because the vigil is over. "I'm fine," I said, because that's what I always said. The walk to Pemberton and Associates took 12 minutes. Daniel filled the silence with updates about his work. A big case he was handling. The new house they were considering in Westchester. I half listened, watching the familiar storefronts of my hometown slide past Henderson's Hardware, where Dad had bought every tool he'd ever owned, Rosie's Diner, where we'd eaten pancakes every Saturday morning when I was little, the old movie theater that had been closed for renovations for so long that no one remembered what it used to show. Mr. James Pemberton was waiting for us in his office on the second floor. He was a man in his 70s with silver hair and the kind of gentle authority that comes from decades of helping families navigate their most difficult moments. His office was lined with law books and family photographs, and it smelled like leather and the faint trace of pipe tobacco. "Sarah, Daniel," he said, standing to shake our hands. "Please, sit down. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your father was a good man." We settled into the leather chairs facing his desk. Daniel checked his phone quickly, then put it away with a guilty glance in my direction. Mr. Pemberton opened a thick file and pulled out several documents. "I know this is difficult," he began, "but your father was very specific about his wishes. He updated his will several times over the years, most recently, about 18 months ago. He wanted to make sure everything was exactly as he intended." 18 months ago. That would have been during Dad's decline, when his good days were becoming rarer and his confusion was growing deeper. I remembered that period. He'd had stretches of clarity that surprised me, moments when he seemed almost like his old self. During one of those clear spells, he'd ask me to drive him somewhere, but he wouldn't tell me where. We'd ended up at Mr. Pemberton's office, and Dad had asked me to wait in the car. "I need to take care of some business," he'd said. "Won't take long." I'd assumed it was something routine. Updating his insurance information, maybe, or signing papers related to his pension. He'd never mentioned a will, never talked about what would happen to his belongings or the house after he was gone. It seemed too final, too much like giving up. Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat and began reading. The legal language was dense, formal, full of whereas and heretofore, and other words that seemed designed to make simple things sound complicated. But the meaning was clear enough. The house. The 3-bedroom ranch where I'd grown up, where Dad had lived for 40 years, where I'd spent the last 5 years of my life, was going to Daniel. The savings account, modest but not insignificant after a lifetime of careful budgeting, was going to Daniel. Dad's pension benefits, his life insurance policy, his collection of vintage tools, his 1987 Ford pickup truck that barely ran but held 1,000 memories. All of it was going to Daniel. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not surprise, exactly, but a kind of hollow recognition. Of course it was going to Daniel. Daniel was the son, the successful one, the one who'd made something of himself in the world beyond Millbrook. I was just the daughter who'd never left, never married, never built anything that mattered beyond the cocoon of caretaking I'd wrapped around Dad's final years. Mr. Pemberton continued reading, his voice steady and professional. Daniel would inherit the rights to Dad's small investment portfolio, the contents of his workshop, even the garden tools and the riding mower that I'd used every summer to keep the yard looking the way Dad liked it. "And finally," Mr. Pemberton said, looking up from the document with an expression I couldn't quite read, "to my daughter Sarah Mitchell, who has given me the greatest gift of all, her presence during my final years, I leave the sum of $1, along with the contents of the metal box hidden behind the loose brick in the basement wall, coordinates marked in the journal she'll find in my bedroom desk." The room went silent. I stared at Mr. Pemberton, certain I'd misheard. $1? After 5 years of my life? After giving up my career and my savings and any chance of a normal existence, Dad had left me a single dollar? Daniel's reaction came first. A snort of laughter, quickly suppressed but not quick enough. He covered his mouth with his hand, but his eyes were dancing with something between amusement and disbelief. "I'm sorry," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "Did you say $1? Mr. Pemberton nodded gravely. $1, and the contents of a metal box, along with instructions for finding it. Daniel couldn't contain himself. The laughter bubbled up like water from a broken pipe. Not cruel, exactly, but thoughtless, automatic. The kind of laughter that escapes when something is so absurd that your brain can't process it any other way. $1, he repeated, shaking his head, and a treasure hunt in the basement. I'm sorry, Sarah, but you have to admit this is... He gestured vaguely, still chuckling. I mean, what could possibly be in a metal box that Dad thought was worth more than the house? His secret cookie recipe? A love letter from high school? I should have been furious. I should have stood up and walked out, should have told my brother exactly what I thought of his reaction to my father's final gesture. But instead, I felt strangely calm. There was something in Mr. Pemberton's expression, something in the way he was watching this scene unfold, that suggested Daniel's laughter might be premature. There's more, Mr. Pemberton said quietly, and Daniel's laughter died abruptly. More? Your father left detailed instructions. Specific instructions about how and when certain information should be shared. He reached into the file and pulled out a sealed envelope. Sarah, this is for you. Your father was very clear that you should read it privately, but... He paused, glancing between us. He also said that if Daniel questioned the inheritance distribution, I should share the contents immediately. Daniel's smile faded entirely. What kind of instructions? Mr. Pemberton didn't answer. Instead, he looked at me. Sarah, would you like to read this now, or would you prefer to take it home? Something in his tone told me that whatever was in that envelope would change everything. I looked at Daniel, saw the uncertainty creeping into his expression, the way his confidence was beginning to crack around the edges. Read it now, I said. Mr. Pemberton opened the envelope with the care of someone handling something precious. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in Dad's handwriting. Not the shaky, uncertain script of his final years, but the strong, clear handwriting I remembered from birthday cards and school permission slips. To my daughter Sarah, Mr. Pemberton read aloud, who stayed when staying was hard, who loved when loving required sacrifice, who gave me the gift of dignity in my final years. The $1 I leave you is symbolic. It represents the debt I can never repay, but the real inheritance is in the basement, where I've kept safe the things that matter most. Follow the map in my desk drawer. Trust the lawyer's smile when he sees what you find. And remember that sometimes the smallest gifts carry the biggest secrets. All my love, Dad. The silence that followed was different from before. It was charged, expectant, like the moment before lightning strikes. Daniel was no longer laughing. His face had gone pale, and he was staring at Mr. Pemberton with the expression of someone who just realized he might have misunderstood something important. What's in the basement? Daniel asked, his voice tight. Mr. Pemberton smiled, the smile Dad had referenced in his letter. It was warm, knowing, and just a little bit mischievous. That, he said, is something Sarah will have to discover for herself. But I will say this, your father was a very wise man, and he understood the difference between wealth and value better than most people ever do. I stood up on shaking legs, the metal box, the coordinates, the map in Dad's desk. It felt like something out of a movie, not something that happened to quiet teachers in small Connecticut towns. But Dad had been full of surprises, even at the end. Maybe especially at the end. I need to go home, I said. Daniel stood too, clearly rattled. Sarah, wait. Maybe we should. You should what? I turned to face him, and for the first time in years, I felt something other than resignation. You should help me look for whatever Dad hid in the basement? You should suddenly be interested in spending time in that house. You should pretend you care about something other than the dollar amount of what you're inheriting? He had the grace to look ashamed. That's not fair. Isn't it? I picked up my purse, my folder, the envelope that had started to change everything. You laughed, Daniel. At Dad's final gift to me, you laughed. You assumed it was nothing because the number was small. Just like you assumed my 5 years with him were nothing because I wasn't earning a salary. Just like you assumed that love could be measured in dollars and cents. Mr. Pemberton was watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone who'd seen family dynamics explode in his office before. But there was something else in his expression, anticipation maybe, or satisfaction, like someone who knew the punchline to a very long joke. "Sarah," Daniel said, his lawyer voice kicking in, smooth and reasonable, "let's not do this here. Let's go home, look at whatever Dad left, and figure this out together." Together? I almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. When have we ever done anything together, Daniel? When have you ever been interested in Dad's secrets or his stories or anything about his life that couldn't be inherited or invested or turned into something profitable? I walked toward the door, then paused. Mr. Pemberton was still smiling that knowing smile, and something occurred to me. "You know what's in the box, don't you?" I asked him. His smile widened. "Your father was my client for 37 years, Sarah. He was also my friend. And yes, I know exactly what's in that box. I helped him put some of it there." Daniel stepped forward. "What are you talking about? What kind of game was Dad playing?" But Mr. Pemberton just shook his head. "Not a game, Daniel, a lesson, and a gift that your sister earned every day for 5 years. I left them there. Daniel demanding answers that wouldn't come. Mr. Pemberton maintaining the same patient, knowing silence that Dad might have maintained if he'd been able to see this moment unfold. The walk home felt different than the walk there. My steps were quicker, purposeful. The dollar inheritance had stung, but Dad's letter had planted something else in its place. Curiosity, hope, and the strangest feeling that maybe, just maybe, the man who'd sometimes forgotten my name had remembered something else entirely. The house was waiting for me, full of shadows and secrets. And somewhere in the basement, hidden behind a loose brick, was a metal box that might contain the answer to why Dad had smiled every time he watched me tend his garden, why he'd held my hand so tightly during his final moments, why he'd chosen to leave me a single dollar and a mystery instead of half his worldly possessions. I was about to find out that sometimes the most valuable inheritances can't be divided equally because they can only be earned by one person, one choice at a time, over years of showing up, when showing up was the hardest thing in the world to do. The house felt different when I walked through the front door alone, not empty. It had felt empty since Dad died, but expectant, like it was holding its breath. Daniel had followed me home, of course, his BMW parked behind my aging Honda Civic in the driveway like an expensive question mark. He tried to make conversation during the 10-minute walk from the lawyer's office, but I wasn't ready to pretend that his laughter hadn't cut deeper than I wanted to admit. "Sarah, come on," he said as I fumbled with my keys. "You can't seriously be angry about this." I was just surprised. $1? "You have to admit it's unusual." I pushed open the door and stepped into the familiar smell of home, coffee grounds and Old Spice aftershave, the lingering scent of the lemon oil I'd used to polish Dad's furniture just days ago. "Unusual doesn't begin to cover it," I said, dropping my purse on the kitchen counter. But then again, Dad was full of surprises. The kitchen looked exactly as I'd left it that morning, but somehow everything felt charged with possibility. Dad's coffee mug sat in the dish drainer where I'd placed it after washing it for the final time. His reading glasses lay folded beside the newspaper he'd never finish. Normal objects that suddenly seemed like clues in a mystery I was only beginning to understand. "Where's this desk he mentioned?" Daniel asked, loosening his tie. He was trying to sound casual, but I could hear the edge in his voice. For the first time in our adult lives, I had something he wanted. Information, access to a secret he couldn't lawyer his way into possessing. "In his bedroom," I said, heading down the hallway. "But maybe you should wait in the living room." "Sarah, don't be ridiculous, we're family. Whatever this is about, we should handle it together." I stopped at the bedroom doorway and turned to look at him, really look at him. Daniel was 45 years old, successful by every measure society used to keep score. He had money, status, a beautiful wife and children who would never want for anything. But standing there in the hallway of our childhood home, He looked like the boy who used to steal cookies from Mom's jar and blame it on me, entitled, impatient, and utterly convinced that the world owed him access to everything he desired. Family, I repeated. That's interesting, because for the last 5 years, family meant me showing up every single day, while you showed up twice a year with expensive wine and awkward small talk. His face flushed. That's not fair. I had responsibilities. So did I, Daniel. I had a career I loved, students who depended on me, a life I built for myself. But I gave it all up because Dad needed someone, and you made it clear it wouldn't be you. I offered to pay for professional care, the best money could buy. He didn't want professional care, he wanted family. He wanted someone who remembered that he used to make terrible jokes during commercial breaks, someone who knew he liked his eggs over easy and his coffee strong enough to wake the dead. He wanted someone who would sit in his garden with him and pretend not to notice when he forgot what we were talking about. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the bedroom. Look, I know you sacrificed a lot. I know I wasn't. I could have done more. But that doesn't change the fact that Dad left me the house and the money, and you got $1 and a scavenger hunt. If there's something valuable hidden in the basement, shouldn't we split it equally? There it was. The real reason he'd followed me home. The real reason he was suddenly interested in Dad's bedroom and his mysterious basement treasure. Daniel wasn't here out of guilt or curiosity or even brotherly concern. He was here because he smelled money and he wanted his cut. No, I said simply. No. Dad left you the house, Daniel. He left you the savings, the insurance, the investments, everything that can be appraised and divided and turned into numbers on a tax form. He left me $1 and whatever's in that box, and I'm going to respect his wishes. I stepped into Dad's bedroom before Daniel could argue further. The room still smelled like him, aftershave and the mint lozenges he'd taken for his cough. The faint scent of the lavender sachets Mom had tucked into his dresser drawers decades ago. His bed was made with hospital corners, the way he'd learned in the Navy. His clothes still hung in the closet, waiting for decisions I wasn't ready to make. The desk sat in the corner by the window, the same oak desk where he'd paid bills and written Christmas cards and helped me with homework when I was small. I'd cleaned it out partially after he died, removing the expired coupons and old bank statements, but I'd left the deeper drawers untouched. They felt too personal, too much like trespassing on memories that weren't meant for anyone but him. Now I pulled open the bottom drawer with trembling fingers. Inside were the things I'd expected to find eventually. Old photographs, birth certificates, my report cards from elementary school tied with a rubber band. But tucked beneath a stack of letters from Mom during their brief courtship was a small leather-bound journal I'd never seen before. The cover was worn smooth, the pages yellowed with age. Dad's handwriting filled every line, but not in the careful script I remembered from his later years. This was different. Urgent, excited, like someone recording important discoveries. I flipped through quickly, catching fragments of entries that made no immediate sense. Found another piece today behind the old foundation stones. The collection is nearly complete. Sarah doesn't know, but she should. When the time comes, she'll understand why I had to keep this secret. What does it say? Daniel asked from the doorway. I closed the journal and slipped it into my pocket. It's personal. Dad's thoughts, memories, nothing that concerns you. But that wasn't entirely true. As I'd flipped through the pages, I'd caught glimpses of something else. Sketches, maps, what looked like documentation of some kind of search that had been going on for years. And my name appeared throughout, always with a kind of reverence that made my chest tight with unexpected emotion. The coordinates Dad had mentioned were written on the inside back cover in his careful handwriting. East wall, 4th brick from the corner, 2 feet from the floor. Behind the loose brick, follow the metal box to the truth. I need to go to the basement, I said. Daniel perked up immediately. I'll come with you. No. I was surprised by the firmness in my own voice. This is something Dad left for me. Just me. If he'd wanted you involved, he would have mentioned you in the letter. Sarah, be reasonable. What if it's something dangerous? What if the basement is unstable? What if it's valuable and you want to make sure you get your share? I interrupted. That's what this is really about, isn't it, Daniel? You can't stand the thought that Dad might have left me something you can't quantify and claim half of. He had the grace to look embarrassed, but he didn't deny it. I just think we should stick together. Family should show up, I said. Family should sacrifice when sacrifice is needed. Family should put love before logistics and presence before profit. You want to talk about family now, Daniel? Where was family when Dad forgot how to tie his shoes? Where was family when he cried because he couldn't remember Mom's maiden name? Where was family during the 3-hour emergency room visits and the sleepless nights and the slow, terrible process of watching the strongest man I knew become confused and frightened and small? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer, more like the brother I remembered from childhood. I couldn't handle it, Sarah. Seeing him like that, it was too hard. It was too hard for me too, I said. But I did it anyway. That's the difference between us. I left him standing in the bedroom and made my way to the basement door. The wooden steps creaked under my feet, the same protest they'd made when I was a child sneaking down to look for Christmas presents or hiding from thunderstorms. The basement smelled like concrete and old cardboard, the accumulated mustiness of decades. Dad had used the basement for storage mostly, holiday decorations, camping equipment that hadn't been used since Daniel and I were teenagers, boxes of Mom's things he couldn't bear to look at but couldn't bring himself to discard. I'd been down here countless times over the years, but I'd never paid attention to the walls, never noticed that one section of the east wall looked slightly different from the rest. The fourth brick from the corner was painted the same white as its neighbors, but when I pressed against it, it shifted slightly. Behind it was a hollow space just large enough for my hand. My fingers found metal, cool, smooth, definitely a box of some kind. I worked it free carefully, my heart hammering against my ribs. The metal box was heavier than I'd expected, about the size of a shoebox but denser, more substantial. It was old, the kind of fireproof document safe people used to keep important papers in before everything went digital. There was no lock, just a simple latch that opened with a soft click. Inside, nestled in faded red velvet, were things that made no immediate sense. A collection of what looked like old coins, but not ordinary coins. These were different, unique, some of them clearly very old. Beneath the coins were documents in protective plastic sleeves, certificates of some kind with ornate borders and official-looking seals. But it was the letter on top that made my hands shake as I lifted it out. My name was written across the envelope in Dad's strong handwriting, and beneath it, a date from just 2 years ago, during one of his clearer periods, when he'd seemed almost like his old self for several weeks. I opened the envelope carefully, aware that I was holding something precious, something that had been waiting for me in the darkness for 2 years. The letter was longer than the one Mr. Pemberton had read, written on Dad's good stationery, the kind he saved for important occasions. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you found the collection I've been building for you since you were 16 years old. Every coin in this box was chosen specifically for you, acquired during the times you were away at college, or working, or living your own life. I started collecting them the day you came home to help with Grandpa Mitchell, and I never stopped. Each one represents a moment when you chose love over convenience, family over personal gain, sacrifice over selfishness." I had to stop reading. My eyes were blurring with tears, and my hands were shaking too hard to hold the paper steady. I could hear Daniel moving around upstairs, probably searching through Dad's things, but his presence felt distant, irrelevant. This moment belonged to me, and the ghost of a man who'd been planning this gift for decades. The letter continued with details about each coin, where he'd found it, why he'd chosen it, what it had cost him to acquire it. Some were rare, some were historically significant, some were valuable simply because they were beautiful. But all of them had been selected with care, with thought, with the kind of love that takes years to accumulate and can never be divided equally. At the bottom of the box, beneath the coins and certificates, was one final surprise, a small cloth bag that jingled softly when I lifted it. Inside were more coins, but these were different, shinier, more recent. A note was tied to the bag with string. "These are the coins I saved from my pocket change every day you took care of me. Every morning I would empty my pockets and set aside 1 coin for you. 5 years, Sarah." 5 years of daily gratitude that you were there when I needed you most. They're not worth much individually, but together they represent something priceless. Time, presence, love, in action. The dollar I left you in the will was symbolic, but these coins are real. They're my way of saying thank you for giving me the gift of your life when I was losing mine. I sat on the basement floor, surrounded by the artifacts of my father's secret gratitude, and finally let myself cry. Not the quiet, controlled tears I'd shed at his funeral, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone who'd just discovered that their sacrifice hadn't gone unnoticed, that their love hadn't been taken for granted, that sometimes the people who seem to forget everything remember the things that matter most. Upstairs, I could hear Daniel calling my name, his voice echoing through the house with increasing frustration. But I didn't answer. Not yet. For now, I wanted to sit in the basement with Dad's final gift and understand that the man who'd sometimes called me by my mother's name had never forgotten who I really was or what I'd given him. The coins glittered in the basement light like stars, each one a small promise that love noticed, that sacrifice mattered, that the daughter who'd stayed had been seen and valued every single day she'd chosen to remain. When I finally emerged from the basement, clutching the metal box against my chest like armor, Daniel was pacing the kitchen with the restless energy of a caged animal. He'd loosened his tie completely and rolled up his sleeves, and there were dust smudges on his expensive suit from what looked like his own unsuccessful search through Dad's belongings. "There you are," he said, relief and frustration warring in his voice. "I was starting to think you'd fallen through the floor. What took so long, and what's in the box?" I set the box carefully on the kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten countless family dinners, where Mom had helped us with homework, where Dad had sat every morning reading his newspaper and drinking coffee strong enough to wake the neighbors. The afternoon light slanted through the window, illuminating the metal surface, and making it look like something precious, something worth waiting for. "It's complicated," I said, which was both completely true and entirely inadequate. Daniel moved closer, his eyes fixed on the box with the intensity of someone who'd spent his career evaluating assets and calculating worth. "Can I see?" Part of me wanted to say no, to guard this gift the way Dad had guarded it for decades, keeping it safe from people who might reduce its meaning to mere numbers. But another part of me, the part that had spent 5 years hoping my brother might finally understand what love looked like in action, wanted him to see, wanted him to comprehend what he'd missed, what he'd dismissed, what he'd laughed at just hours earlier. I opened the box slowly, watching Daniel's expression change as the contents came into view. His eyes widened as he took in the coins nestled in their velvet lining, the official-looking certificates, the careful organization that spoke of years of thoughtful collecting. "Are those?" He reached toward one of the coins, then stopped himself. "Sarah, are those what I think they are?" I picked up one of the certificates and handed it to him. It was from a numismatic authentication service, the kind of official documentation that serious collectors use to verify the authenticity and value of rare coins. The coin it described, a 1909 SVDB Lincoln cent, was valued at $1,800. Daniel's hands shook slightly as he examined the certificate. This is real?" "Dad started collecting them when I was 16, I said, lifting out another certificate. "This one's from 1943. A copper penny they made by mistake during the war when they were supposed to be making them from steel. It's worth $85,000. The number hung in the air between us like a physical thing. Daniel stared at the certificate, then at me, then back at the certificate. I watched him do the math, saw the exact moment when he realized that my dollar inheritance might be worth more than the house, the savings account, and the life insurance policy combined. $85,000, he whispered, for one penny. "There are 37 coins in this collection," I said, picking up Dad's detailed inventory list. He documented everything, when he bought each one, where he found it, what he paid for it, what condition it was in. Some of them have increased in value significantly since he acquired them. I watched Daniel's face transform as the implications sank in. The successful lawyer who'd laughed at his sister's pitiful inheritance was beginning to understand that he might have been celebrating prematurely. But more than that, and I could see this realization dawning in his eyes like a slow sunrise, he was beginning to understand that Dad had been planning this for decades, that the man he dismissed as absent-minded and overly sentimental had orchestrated the most elegant reversal of fortune Daniel had ever witnessed. "How long did he work on this?" Daniel asked, his voice barely audible. I pulled out Dad's journal and flipped through the pages, each one chronicling another addition to the collection. 26 years. He started the year I came home to help with Grandpa Mitchell. Every major sacrifice I made for this family, he marked with a new coin. When I stayed home from college for a semester to help with Mom's cancer treatments, he bought a 1914 D Lincoln cent. When I turned down the job offer in Boston to stay close to home, he found a Morgan silver dollar from 1893. When I gave up my apartment to move back in with him after his diagnosis, he acquired something he'd been searching for years to find, a 1916 D Mercury dime in perfect condition. Daniel sat down heavily in Dad's chair, still holding the authentication certificate. He was keeping track. I confirmed. Every choice I made, every opportunity I gave up, every time I put family first, he noticed, and he found a way to honor it. I reached into the box and pulled out the small cloth bag that had been at the bottom, the one filled with ordinary coins from Dad's daily pocket change. And these are from the last 5 years. Every day I took care of him, he saved 1 coin from his pocket. They're not worth much individually, but together. I poured them onto the table, and they scattered across the surface like metallic confetti. There had to be hundreds of them. Quarters, dimes, nickels, pennies, each one representing a day when I'd helped him remember how to button his shirt, when I'd coaxed him to eat breakfast, when I'd sat beside his bed during a restless night. 5 years of daily gratitude, I said softly. He couldn't always remember my name, but he never forgot to save a coin for me. Daniel picked up one of the pennies from the scattered pile, turning it over in his palm. It was ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of coin most people wouldn't bother to pick up off the sidewalk. But in the context of Dad's final gift, it became something else entirely. Proof of attention, evidence of love, a small daily ritual that had connected him to his daughter, even when his mind was failing. "I don't understand," Daniel said finally. "If he was planning this, if he knew these coins were valuable, why didn't he tell you? Why the secrecy? Why make it look like he was leaving you nothing?" I sat down across from him and pulled Dad's final letter from the box. He explained that too. I read aloud the passage I'd memorized in the basement. "Sarah, I kept this collection secret because I needed to know that your care for me came from love, not expectation of reward. I needed to know that you would stay with me and tend to me, and sacrifice for me even if you thought there was nothing in it for you except the knowledge that you were doing right by someone who loved you. The coins were never meant to be payment for your devotion. They were meant to be proof that your devotion was seen, valued, and treasured beyond measure." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock above the sink. Daniel stared at the coins scattered across the table, and I could see him processing not just their monetary value, but their emotional weight. For the first time since we were children, my successful, confident, always in control brother looked completely lost. "He was testing us," Daniel said quietly. "Both of us." "Not testing," I corrected. "Teaching. There's a difference." Daniel looked up at me, and for a moment I saw past the expensive suit and the Manhattan confidence to the boy who used to build blanket forts with me on rainy Saturday afternoons. What was he teaching me? The question hung between us, heavy with implications. I could have been cruel. I could have listed all the ways Daniel had failed Dad's test, all the opportunities he'd missed to prove that family meant more to him than convenience. But looking at my brother, really looking at him, I saw something I hadn't expected to see. Genuine remorse and the beginning of understanding. "I think," I said carefully, "he was teaching you what I learned a long time ago, that some things can't be bought or delegated or put off until it's more convenient. That presence is a gift you can't give retroactively. That love isn't something you can express through a bank transfer, or a nice facility, or a phone call on holidays." Daniel nodded slowly, still turning the penny over in his hands. I thought I was being practical. I thought money solved problems. "Money solves some problems," I said. "But it doesn't solve loneliness. It doesn't solve fear. It doesn't solve the confusion of waking up in the middle of the night, not knowing where you are, or who the person beside your bed is supposed to be." "I was scared," Daniel admitted, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. Seeing Dad like that, it terrified me. The man who taught me to drive, who helped me study for the bar exam, who was the smartest person I knew, watching him disappear piece by piece, I couldn't handle it. I was scared too, I said, every single day, but I stayed anyway. Daniel set the penny down carefully among its companions and looked at me with something I hadn't seen in his eyes since we were children: respect. The house, he said suddenly. The savings, the life insurance. I don't want them. I blinked. What? I don't deserve them. You're right about everything. You sacrificed 5 years of your life while I made excuses. You earned whatever Dad left you, and he gestured helplessly. I laughed at you. At his final gift to you, I'm ashamed of myself. Daniel, you don't have to. Yes, I do. He stood up, suddenly decisive in the way that had made him successful in court. Dad's will stands as written, but I'm going to deed the house to you. The money, the insurance, we'll split it equally. That's what should have happened in the first place. I stared at him, trying to process this unexpected turn. Why? Because Dad was right. You were here. You did the hard work. You earned the inheritance, and I inherited the lesson. He managed a rueful smile. Though I have to admit, his teaching methods were a little more dramatic than necessary. I looked down at the coins scattered across the table, each one catching the light like a small star. The collection was worth more money than I'd ever dreamed of having, enough to change my life completely. But sitting there in Dad's kitchen with my brother, really talking to my brother for the first time in years, I realized that the monetary value wasn't the real gift. The real gift was the knowledge that Dad had seen me, had valued my choices, had understood the weight of what I'd given up for him. The real gift was the proof that love doesn't always announce itself with grand gestures. Sometimes it works quietly, patiently, building something precious and secret until the moment comes to reveal it. And maybe, just maybe, the real gift was this moment with Daniel, when the brother who'd been lost in his own life for so long finally found his way back to understanding what family actually meant. I began gathering the coins, placing them carefully back in their velvet-lined box. Tomorrow I would take them to an appraiser, would learn the exact numerical value of Dad's decades-long expression of gratitude. But tonight I just wanted to sit with the knowledge that the man who'd sometimes forgotten my name had never forgotten to love me. There's something else, I said, remembering the phone call that had started this entire revelation. Mr. Pemberton. He said he helped Dad put some of these things in the box. I think we should call him. Daniel nodded. I think you're right. I have a feeling Dad's lesson isn't quite finished yet. Mr. Pemberton answered his office phone on the second ring, as if he'd been waiting for our call. It was nearly 6 o'clock on a Wednesday evening, well past normal business hours, but his voice carried none of the rushed impatience I'd expected from a lawyer being contacted after hours. Sarah, he said warmly, before I'd even identified myself, I was wondering when you'd call. I take it you found what your father left for you? I did, I said, cradling the phone between my ear and shoulder while Daniel leaned in close enough to hear. We were still sitting at the kitchen table, the metal box open between us like a treasure chest that had surrendered its secrets. Mr. Pemberton, I need to understand something. When you said you helped Dad put some of these things in the box, what exactly did you mean? There was a pause, and I could hear the sound of papers rustling, a chair creaking. Are you both there? You and Daniel? We're both here, Daniel said, speaking toward the phone, and I owe you an apology for my behavior this morning. I was wrong about a lot of things. No apology necessary, Daniel. Your father predicted your reaction quite accurately. In fact, he was counting on it. Mr. Pemberton's voice carried what sounded like affection, the tone of someone who genuinely cared for his client. Would it be possible for you both to come back to my office? There are some things I can show you that will make more sense in person. I glanced at Daniel, who nodded immediately. Of course. Should we come now? If you don't mind, I'll wait for you. And Sarah, bring the box. The walk back to Pemberton and Associates felt surreal, like retracing steps through a dream that had turned into something entirely different from what I'd expected when I woke up that morning. The evening light cast long shadows across Main Street, and the familiar storefronts looked softer somehow, less sharp-edged than they had during our earlier walk. Daniel carried the metal box without being asked, cradling it carefully against his chest. We didn't talk much during the short journey. but the silence between us was different now. Not the strained quiet of siblings who'd grown apart, but the contemplative hush of people processing something significant. Mr. Pemberton was waiting for us in his office, but he'd changed out of his formal suit into a comfortable cardigan and slacks, making him look less like a lawyer and more like someone's beloved grandfather. The overhead lights were dimmed, and he'd lit a small desk lamp that cast a warm glow over the legal documents and family photographs that covered his workspace. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to the same chairs we'd occupied that morning. "I've been looking forward to this conversation for a very long time." Daniel set the box on Mr. Pemberton's desk, and the older man opened it with the reverence of someone handling something sacred. He lifted out one of the coins, a silver dollar that caught the lamplight and threw tiny rainbows across the ceiling. "Your father brought me this one in 1998, he said, turning the coin over in his palm. "It was right after Sarah turned down that job offer in Boston to stay closer to home. Robert was so proud of her decision, but also heartbroken that it meant giving up an opportunity. He wanted to find a way to honor the sacrifice." "You were there when he bought these?" I asked. "Not just when he bought them," Mr. Pemberton said with a smile. "I helped him find them." You see, Robert knew nothing about coin collecting when he started this project. He came to me because he knew I'd been collecting coins as a hobby for 30 years. I became his advisor, his research partner, and eventually, his co-conspirator. He moved to a filing cabinet behind his desk and pulled out a thick folder. "This contains every receipt, every authentication certificate, every piece of correspondence related to your collection, Sarah. Your father was meticulous about documentation because he wanted you to understand not just what he was giving you, but why he chose each piece." Daniel leaned forward. "How long have you known about this?" "Since the beginning, 26 years. Mr. Pemberton returned to his seat and opened the folder. "Robert made me promise to help him, but also to keep the secret until after he was gone. He was very specific about that. He said the gift would only have meaning if Sarah's care for him came from love, not expectation." I felt tears pricking at my eyes. "He really planned all of this?" "Oh, my dear, he planned much more than this." Mr. Pemberton pulled out a legal document I didn't recognize. "The coin collection was just the beginning. Your father spent years setting up a trust fund that has been earning interest for over 2 decades. Every dollar he saved by living modestly, every bonus from his pension, every bit of unexpected income went into that fund." My breath caught. "A trust fund?" "Specifically designed to provide for your future, Sarah. He knew that caring for him would mean sacrificing your career, your savings, your retirement planning. The trust was his way of ensuring that your generosity wouldn't leave you financially vulnerable." Mr. Pemberton slid the document across the desk. "As of today, it's worth just over $340,000. The number seemed impossible, too large to process. I stared at the document, seeing Dad's signature at the bottom but unable to comprehend what I was reading. Daniel whistled softly. $340,000, plus the coin collection. Sarah, do you realize what this means?" But Mr. Pemberton held up a hand. "There's more." "More?" I felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Dad had orchestrated. "I don't understand. Why didn't he just leave this to me in the will? Why the elaborate setup with the basement and the box and the $1? "Because your father understood something about human nature that took me many years to appreciate," Mr. Pemberton said gently. "He knew that if he'd simply left you a large inheritance, it would have felt like payment for services rendered. It would have reduced your years of devotion to a transaction. But by making you search for it, by making you discover the story behind each coin, by letting you see how long he'd been planning this gift, he transformed it into something else entirely." "Into what?" "Into proof of love. Into evidence that your sacrifice was witnessed and treasured. Into a demonstration that the father, who sometimes couldn't remember your name, never forgot who you were or what you meant to him." I thought about the journal entries I'd found, the careful documentation of each addition to the collection, the daily coins saved during his illness. He was keeping a record of my love by recording his own. "Exactly," Mr. Pemberton smiled, "and there's one final piece to his plan." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written across it in Dad's handwriting. But this envelope was different from the others. Heavier, more formal, with the kind of weight that suggested legal documents inside. Your father asked me to give this to you only after you'd discovered the coins in the trust fund. He said you'd need the full context to understand what he was asking of you. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter written on official legal stationery, along with several other documents I couldn't immediately identify. My dearest Sarah, the letter began, if you're reading this, then James has shared the full scope of what I've built for you over the years. I hope you understand now that every sacrifice you made was seen, valued, and honored. But I have one final request, one last way for you to help me take care of our family. I looked up at Mr. Pemberton, who was watching me with knowing eyes. What is he asking? Keep reading. The trust fund and the coin collection are yours to do with as you wish, Dad's letter continued, but I hope you'll consider using part of this inheritance to establish a scholarship fund at Millbrook Elementary School. I've seen how much you love teaching, how much you've missed working with children. This would be a way to honor your mother's memory. She always said the best teachers are the ones who understand that love is the foundation of all learning. My throat tightened. A scholarship fund? Of course Dad would think of something like that, something that would turn his gift into a gift for others. There's more, the letter continued. I've also set aside funds to create a respite care program for families dealing with Alzheimer's. You know better than anyone how isolating and exhausting it can be to care for someone with this disease. I want other families to have the support we never had, the breaks we never took, the help we never asked for. I set the letter down, overwhelmed. He wants me to give it away. Not give it away, Daniel said quietly. Multiply it, turn his gift into gifts for other people. Mr. Pemberton nodded. Your father spent the last 2 years of his life, during his clearest moments, working with me to structure these programs. He wanted them to be sustainable, professionally managed, and focused on real help for real families. The documents in that envelope contain all the legal framework needed to establish both the scholarship fund and the respite care program. I picked up the other documents, scanning through pages of legal language that outlined a comprehensive plan for turning Dad's secret inheritance into lasting help for others. It was ambitious, thoughtful, and completely characteristic of the man who'd spent his life quietly taking care of people. How much? I asked. He suggested dedicating half of the trust fund to these programs, leaving you with enough to secure your own future, while still making a significant impact on your community. Mr. Pemberton leaned back in his chair. Of course, the choice is entirely yours. Your father was very clear that this was a request, not a requirement. I looked at Daniel, who was studying the documents with his lawyer's eye for detail. What do you think? I think, Daniel said slowly, that Dad was a much smarter man than I ever gave him credit for, and I think you should do exactly what he's asking. But it's a lot of money, Daniel. It could completely change my life. It already has changed your life, he said. The money is just the proof. But this... He gestured to the scholarship and respite care proposals. This is how you honor what Dad was really trying to teach us. Mr. Pemberton was quiet, letting us process the magnitude of Dad's final request. Outside his office windows, Millbrook was settling into evening, families finishing dinner and helping children with homework, the ordinary rhythms of small-town life, continuing unchanged. But inside this room, we were grappling with the realization that Dad had orchestrated not just an inheritance but a legacy. There's one more thing, Mr. Pemberton said softly. Your father asked me to tell you something if you decided to move forward with his programs. What? He said to tell you that this was always his plan for the $1 he left you in his will. He wanted you to take that single dollar and discover that it could become thousands of dollars of help for other families. He said it was his way of showing you that sometimes the smallest gifts carry the biggest possibilities. I felt the truth of Dad's final lessons settling over me like a warm blanket. The dollar inheritance that had seemed so cruel, so dismissive, had been the key to unlocking not just hidden treasure but hidden purpose. He'd given me wealth, yes, but more importantly, he'd given me a way to transform my years of sacrifice into ongoing service to others. "I'll do it," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "All of it. The scholarship fund, the respite care program, exactly as he planned." Daniel smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile I'd seen from him all day. "He knew you would. That's why he chose you for this." As we prepared to leave Mr. Pemberton's office for the second time that day, I realized that Dad's inheritance had accomplished something I'd never expected. It had brought my brother and me back together, united in understanding what our father had really been trying to teach us about love, sacrifice, and the true meaning of wealth. The $1 that had started this journey was still in my purse, but now I understood what it represented. Not the end of Dad's story, but the beginning of mine. The next morning brought an unseasonable warmth to Millbrook, the kind of spring day that makes you believe in new beginnings. I woke up in my childhood bedroom for what I suspected might be one of the last times, sunlight streaming through the daisy-patterned wallpaper and casting familiar shadows across the floor where I'd played with dolls, and later sprawled with homework and eventually paced while making difficult decisions about Dad's care. Daniel had called at 7:30, his voice carrying an energy I hadn't heard in years. "I've found someone," he said without preamble. "Dr. Margaret Chen. She's a numismatic appraiser in Hartford, been in the business for 30 years. She can see us today if we drive up there." "You found her already?" "I couldn't sleep," Daniel admitted. "I kept thinking about Dad's collection, about what he'd put together. I needed to know exactly what we're dealing with. What you're dealing with," he corrected himself. "This is your inheritance, Sarah. I want to make sure you understand its full value." 2 hours later, we were sitting in Dr. Chen's office in a converted Victorian house in Hartford's West End. The office felt more like a museum than a business. Glass cases filled with rare coins, walls lined with certificates and historical documents, everything bathed in the soft light that serious collectors use to avoid damaging delicate artifacts. Dr. Chen herself was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and the kind of glasses that spoke of decades spent examining tiny details. She'd laid Dad's collection out on a specialized examination table, each coin in its own protective holder, the authentication certificates arranged like a paper trail of Dad's secret obsession. "This is remarkable," she said, adjusting her magnifying lamp to examine a particular coin more closely. "Whoever assembled this collection had exceptional knowledge and incredible patience. These aren't just valuable coins. They're coins that tell a story about American history, about the evolution of our currency, about the art of collecting itself." I watched her work, mesmerized by the care she took with each piece. She photographed every coin from multiple angles, cross-referenced serial numbers with authentication databases, made notes in handwriting so neat it looked like calligraphy. "The 1943 copper penny alone," she continued, "is museum quality. There are fewer than 20 known to exist, and this one is in exceptional condition. Your father must have searched for years to find one this pristine." "He did," I said softly. "He told me in his journal that he spent 3 years tracking down that particular coin. He wanted it to mark the year I stayed home from a teaching conference to take care of my mother when she was undergoing chemotherapy." Dr. Chen looked up from her examination, her expression softening. "Each coin was chosen for a specific reason?" "Each one represents a sacrifice my sister made for our family," Daniel said, and I was surprised by the pride in his voice. 26 years of putting family first, and my father marked every instance with a coin. How extraordinary. Dr. Chen returned to her work, but I could see that our explanation had changed how she viewed the collection. She was no longer just appraising valuable artifacts. She was handling love letters written in metal and time. The process took 3 hours. Dr. Chen examined every coin, verified every certificate, cross-checked market values and auction results. She made calls to other experts, consulted reference books that looked older than I was, and approached the entire task with the thoroughness of someone who understood that numbers on a page could represent dreams fulfilled or dreams deferred. When she finally set down her magnifying glass and turned to face us, her expression was a mixture of professional excitement and personal wonder. "The collection as it stands today," she said, consulting her notes, "has a conservative auction value of $847,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. I'd known the coins were valuable, the certificates had made that clear, but hearing the total somehow made it real in a way that individual appraisals hadn't. $847,000, Daniel repeated slowly, plus the trust fund. Sarah, you're looking at well over $1 million. Dr. Chen nodded. And that's a conservative estimate based on current market conditions. Some of these coins are so rare that they could exceed their appraised values significantly at auction, particularly if the story behind the collection becomes known. Collectors pay premiums for pieces with provenance, with meaning. I've thought about Dad sitting in this same kind of office over the years, carefully selecting each coin, negotiating prices, arranging authentication. The man who'd clipped coupons and driven the same truck for 15 years had been quietly assembling a treasure that most people could only dream of owning. There's something else, Dr. Chen continued. I've been in this business for 3 decades, and I've never seen a collection quite like this. The way it's organized, the documentation, the clear narrative thread. This isn't just valuable, it's historically significant. There are museums that would be interested in this collection, universities that would want to study it as an example of how personal history intersects with numismatic history. What are you saying? I asked. I'm saying your father created something unique. If you decided to donate part or all of this collection to a museum, it could become a permanent exhibit about family, sacrifice, and the ways people choose to honor love. The tax benefits alone would be substantial, but more importantly, it would ensure that your father's story and yours would be preserved for future generations. Daniel and I exchanged glances. Neither of us had considered that Dad's private gift might have public value, that his secret way of honoring my choices might become a way for other families to understand the true meaning of inheritance. We'll need time to think about that, Daniel said, but thank you for the information. On the drive back to Millbrook, we were both quiet, processing not just the monetary value of what Dad had left me, but the magnitude of the possibilities it represented. The scholarship fund, the respite care program, and now potentially a museum exhibit. Dad's $1 inheritance was becoming a key that could unlock opportunities I'd never imagined. I need to apologize to you, Daniel said as we pulled into the driveway of our childhood home, not just for laughing yesterday, but for everything. For the last 5 years, for the years before that, for not understanding what you were doing or why it mattered. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment, looking at the house where so much had happened. Births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows, the daily rituals of a family learning how to love each other imperfectly but persistently. You don't need to apologize, Daniel. We all handle things differently. No, I do need to apologize. Because Dad was right about everything. You were here when it mattered. You made the hard choices. You earned every penny of what he left you, and I... He paused, struggling with words. I took the easy way out, and then I had the nerve to question whether you deserved what you got. We sat in the car for another few minutes, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the yard Dad had loved so much. His tomato plants were already showing signs of neglect. I'd been too overwhelmed to maintain his careful watering schedule, but the early spring flowers Mom had planted decades ago were starting to bloom, creating splashes of color against the backdrop of our family's history. There's something I want to tell you, I said, something Dad said to me during one of his clearer moments last year. Daniel turned to face me fully. He told me he was proud of both of his children. He said you'd become everything he'd hoped you'd become, successful, intelligent, capable of taking care of your own family. He said he wasn't disappointed in you for not being here, because he'd raised you to build a life beyond Millbrook, and you'd done exactly that. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He said that? He said he'd failed you in one way, though. He said he'd never taught you that success wasn't just about what you could build for yourself, but about what you could preserve for others. He said that was his fault, not yours. But he taught me in the end, didn't he? Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. This whole elaborate plan, it wasn't just about rewarding you, it was about teaching both of us something important. I nodded. I think he wanted you to see that love isn't always convenient, that family isn't always easy, but that the people who show up when showing up is hard are the ones who deserve to be honored. And he wanted me to understand that money isn't the only way to measure value. We got out of the car and walked toward the house together, but instead of going inside, Daniel stopped at Dad's garden. The tomato stakes were still in place, waiting for plants that would never be planted by the hands that had tended this plot for 40 years. "I want to help," Daniel said suddenly, "with the scholarship fund, the respite care program, all of it. Not financially, that's your decision to make, but with the legal work, the setup, the ongoing management, I want to be part of what Dad envisioned." "Daniel, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because Dad was right about something else. Family isn't just about biology or shared history. It's about choosing to show up, even when it's late, even when you've already missed too much." That evening, we sat at the kitchen table with Dad's journal, the coin collection, and a laptop, beginning to plan how to transform his secret inheritance into the public legacy he'd envisioned. The scholarship fund would help children from families like ours, families where financial constraints might limit educational opportunities. The respite care program would provide support for caregivers who were doing what I'd done, sacrificing their own lives to care for family members with degenerative diseases. As we worked, I found myself thinking about the $1 bill still tucked in my purse. Tomorrow, I would frame it and hang it in whatever office I established to manage Dad's programs. It would serve as a reminder that the smallest gifts, when multiplied by love and intention, could become something magnificent. "You know what the strangest part of all this is?" I said as we finished outlining the basic structure of the scholarship fund. "What?" "Yesterday morning, I thought I was the daughter who got nothing. I thought Dad had forgotten what I'd done for him, that he'd valued your success more than my sacrifice." Daniel looked up from the legal documents he was reviewing. "And now? Now I realize I got everything. Not just the money, not just the coins, but the knowledge. That he saw me, that he valued what I did, that he spent 26 years proving that love notices everything, even when it doesn't say anything out loud." "He was always the smartest one in the family," Daniel said with a smile. "Even when we thought he was losing his mind, he was 3 steps ahead of all of us." Outside, the spring evening was settling over Millbrook like a gentle blessing. In a few weeks, I would need to make decisions about the house, about my future, about how to honor Dad's wishes while building a life that was truly my own. But tonight, I was content to sit in the kitchen where I'd learned to cook Dad's favorite meals, surrounded by the evidence of his secret love and my brother's newfound understanding of what family really meant. The dollar inheritance had become a $1 million legacy, but more importantly, it had become a bridge back to the brother I'd thought I'd lost and forward to a future I'd never imagined possible. 3 weeks after the appraisal, I found myself standing in the hallway of Millbrook Elementary School for the first time in over 5 years. The familiar smell of construction paper and cafeteria food mixed with the underlying scent of childhood dreams and possibility. Mrs. Chen, the principal who had held my teaching position open as long as she could, greeted me at the main office with a smile that held both warmth and curiosity. "Sarah Mitchell," she said, extending her hand. "I have to admit, when you called asking to meet about establishing a scholarship fund, I was intrigued. The Sarah I remember was always generous with her time, but this is something else entirely." I carried a leather portfolio that Daniel had given me, professional, expensive, the kind of thing that announced serious business. Inside were the preliminary documents for what we were calling the Robert Mitchell Memorial Scholarship Fund, along with financial projections that still made my head spin when I looked at them too directly. "It's what my father would have wanted," I said, settling into the same chair where I'd once discussed lesson plans and student progress reports. He believed that education was the foundation of everything else. Mrs. Chen opened the folder I'd given her and began reading through the proposal Daniel had helped me draft. Her eyebrows rose steadily as she processed the scope of what we were planning. $50,000 annually, she said slowly. For families facing financial hardship, with priority given to students whose parents are caregivers for family members with chronic illnesses. The criteria were very specific in my father's notes, I explained. He understood that when families are dealing with long-term illness, educational expenses often become impossible luxuries. He wanted to make sure those children didn't have to choose between helping their families and pursuing their dreams. Mrs. Chen looked up from the documents. Sarah, this would change lives. Not just for the scholarship recipients, but for entire families. Do you understand the impact this could have on our community? I thought about the nights I'd lain awake during Dad's illness, calculating and recalculating our expenses, wondering if I'd ever be able to afford graduate school or professional development or any of the things that might have advanced my career. I thought about the families I'd met in doctors' waiting rooms, parents who looked exhausted from juggling work and caregiving, children who seemed older than their years because they'd learned too early that life included difficult choices. I hope I do, I said. That's exactly what we're aiming for. The meeting lasted 2 hours. We discussed implementation timelines, selection criteria, partnership opportunities with other local organizations. Mrs. Chen introduced me to the guidance counselor, the social worker, and the district's community liaison coordinator. By the time I left, we had the framework for a program that would begin accepting applications in the fall. From the elementary school, I drove across town to Millbrook Community Center, where I had a meeting with Janet Torres, the Director of Senior Services. The community center occupied a converted Victorian mansion that had been donated to the town in the 1980s, and Janet's office was in what had once been a parlor, complete with original hardwood floors and a fireplace that hadn't worked in decades. Respite care, Janet said, leaning back in her chair as she reviewed the second proposal in my portfolio. Sarah, I can't tell you how desperately we need something like this. We get calls every week from families who are burning out, who are at the end of their rope, who need just a few hours to remember who they are outside of being caregivers. The respite care program was more complex than the scholarship fund. It would require trained staff, liability insurance, coordination with medical professionals, and careful screening of volunteers. But it was also more personal for me. Every detail of the program was informed by my own experience of isolation, exhaustion, and the peculiar loneliness that comes from watching someone you love disappear gradually. We're envisioning trained volunteers who can provide companionship and basic care for a few hours at a time, I explained. Nothing medical, nothing beyond what a loving family member might do, but enough to let the primary caregiver go grocery shopping, take a walk, maybe even see a movie. Janet nodded enthusiastically. And support groups for the caregivers themselves. That's brilliant, Sarah. People need to know they're not alone in this. My father left detailed notes about that too, I said, pulling out another section of Dad's comprehensive plan. He wanted monthly meetings, maybe a lending library of resources, transportation assistance for families who couldn't afford gas to get to support meetings. How did he think of all this? I smiled, thinking about the man who'd sometimes forgotten what day it was but had never forgotten to save a coin for me every morning. He lived it, in his own way. He watched me struggle with caregiving, and he paid attention to what was missing, what would have helped. By the time I finished my meetings that day, my head was spinning with timelines and budgets, partnership agreements and legal requirements. But underneath the administrative complexity, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Excitement about the future. Anticipation of meaningful work, the satisfaction that comes from turning pain into purpose. That evening, Daniel came over with Chinese takeout and a stack of legal documents that needed my signature. We'd fallen into an easy routine over the past few weeks. He would handle the legal and financial aspects of setting up Dad's programs, while I focused on the community partnerships and practical implementation. The IRS paperwork for the scholarship fund is almost complete, he said, spreading lo mein across Dad's kitchen table. We should have nonprofit status within 60 days. And the respite care program? More complicated, because we're dealing with vulnerable populations and liability issues. But I've been talking to other attorneys who specialize in nonprofit healthcare organizations. We'll get there. I watched my brother navigate through tax codes and regulatory requirements with the same intensity he'd once brought to corporate law. But there was something different in his approach now. Less about winning and more about serving. Less about maximizing profit and more about maximizing impact. Daniel, I said, can I ask you something? Of course. Why are you doing this, really? You already said you were sorry. You already offered to deed me the house. You don't owe me anything more. He set down his chopsticks and looked at me with an expression I was still getting used to. Open, vulnerable, nothing like the polished professional mask he'd worn for so many years. Because for the first time in my adult life, I'm working on something that matters, he said. Corporate law paid the bills and boosted my ego, but at the end of the day, I was just helping rich people get richer. This, he gestured to the papers scattered across the table. This is going to help families like ours, people who are making the kinds of sacrifices you made. But it's not your responsibility. Maybe not, but it's my opportunity. Dad gave you the coins and the money, but he gave me something too, the chance to learn what he'd been trying to teach me all along. That the most important inheritance isn't what you receive, it's what you pass on. Over the following weeks, our lives developed a new rhythm. Mornings were for meetings with bank managers, nonprofit consultants, potential board members for Dad's programs. Afternoons were for paperwork, phone calls, and the endless small details that transform good intentions into functional organizations. Evenings were for planning, dreaming, and sometimes just sitting in Dad's garden, talking about the man who'd orchestrated this entire transformation from beyond the grave. Victoria began joining us for these planning sessions, bringing a perspective I hadn't expected. As someone who'd managed volunteer organizations for years, she understood the practical challenges of running nonprofit programs in small communities. You'll need sustainable fundraising beyond the initial endowment, she said during one of our Thursday evening meetings. Corporate sponsors, annual giving campaigns, maybe a signature event that brings the community together around your mission. I was surprised by how much I enjoyed working with her. Away from the formal social situations where we'd always felt awkward around each other, Victoria revealed herself to be thoughtful, practical, and genuinely committed to making Dad's vision work. What about the boys? I asked. Do they understand what their grandfather was planning? Victoria smiled. They're fascinated by the coin collection. Daniel's been explaining how Grandpa Robert chose each coin to represent something important, and they've started their own collection. Not valuable coins, just interesting ones they find. They want to create stories for each one, the way their grandfather did. The idea that Dad's legacy was already influencing another generation filled me with a warmth I hadn't expected. His lesson about paying attention, about honoring sacrifice, about finding meaning in small gestures, was being passed down to children who would never have the chance to know him personally but could still learn from his example. One evening in late May, as spring was giving way to summer and Dad's garden was showing the first signs of the neglect I couldn't bring myself to remedy, Daniel and I received a call from Mr. Pemberton. "I have something for you both," he said, "something your father left with instructions not to share until the programs were officially established. Can you meet me at my office tomorrow afternoon?" We exchanged glances across the kitchen table, surrounded by the familiar chaos of our project planning. After weeks of discoveries and revelations, we'd thought Dad's surprises were exhausted. Apparently, we'd been wrong again. "More instructions?" I asked. "One final piece of the puzzle," Mr. Pemberton said. "I think you'll find it illuminating." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Dad's dollar inheritance had become something far more complex and beautiful than either Daniel or I had imagined possible. What had started as a seemingly cruel joke had transformed into a masterclass in love, sacrifice, and the true meaning of wealth. Tomorrow would bring another surprise, another layer to Dad's carefully orchestrated lesson. But tonight, I was content to sit in the kitchen, where he'd planned this entire elaborate gift, surrounded by the evidence of how one man's quiet attention to his daughter's sacrifice had become a community's commitment to supporting other families facing similar challenges. The dollar bill was still in my purse, waiting to be framed and displayed in the office we were setting up to manage Dad's programs, but it had already served its purpose, transforming skepticism into understanding, division into unity, and inheritance into legacy. The next afternoon, Daniel and I walked into Mr. Pemberton's office for what we assumed would be the last time. The familiar mahogany-paneled room felt different now, less intimidating, more like the office of a family friend who'd helped orchestrate the most elaborate gift either of us had ever received. Mr. Pemberton was waiting with a manila envelope that looked older than the others, its edges softened by time and handling. "Before I show you what's inside," he said, settling behind his desk with the careful movements of someone preparing to share something significant, "I want you to know that your father made me promise to wait until both programs were officially established. He said the timing was crucial for understanding his final message. I glanced at Daniel, who was leaning forward with the same intense curiosity that had driven him through law school. We'd received the nonprofit status confirmations for both the scholarship fund and the respite care program just 3 days earlier. The timing felt too precise to be coincidental. He was still planning, even at the end, I said. Oh, my dear, he never stopped planning. Mr. Pemberton opened the envelope and withdrew a document that was clearly much older than the others we'd seen. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the typing done on what looked like a manual typewriter. This is your father's original will, written 27 years ago, just after your mother's funeral. My breath caught. His original will? The one that predates all the amendments, all the careful orchestration, all the elaborate planning that led to last week's revelations. Mr. Pemberton placed the document on his desk where we could both see it. I want you to read what he wrote about inheritance, about family, about the responsibility of love. I picked up the document with trembling hands. Dad's younger handwriting filled the margins with notes and corrections, but his signature at the bottom was strong and confident, nothing like the shaky script of his final years. The language was simple, direct, lacking the legal complexity of the will we'd heard read just weeks earlier. But it was the personal message at the end that made my eyes fill with tears. To my children, Daniel and Sarah, I leave you everything I have built in this life, but more importantly, I leave you the responsibility to understand what wealth really means. True inheritance is not what you receive, but what you choose to do with what you've been given. The greatest fortune is not money in the bank, but love in action. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and it's your turn to decide what kind of legacy our family will leave. Daniel reached over and took my hand. He was always teaching us. But there's more, Mr. Pemberton said gently. Turn to the last page. The final page contained a handwritten note that was clearly added years later, the ink darker, the handwriting showing the slight tremor that had developed during Dad's final years. My dearest children, if you've discovered the coins, the trust fund, and the programs I've planned, then you've learned that the most valuable inheritance can't be divided equally, because it can only be earned through love in action. Sarah earned her inheritance through 26 years of sacrifice. Daniel will earn his inheritance through understanding what sacrifice means and choosing to honor it. The dollar I left Sarah was never meant to be the end of the story. It was meant to be the beginning. Watch what $1 can become when it's planted in soil, prepared by love and tended by gratitude. This is my final gift to both of you. The knowledge that wealth multiplies when it's shared, that love grows when it's given away, and that the best inheritance is not what you keep for yourself, but what you create for others. All my love, Dad. I set the document down, overwhelmed by the realization that even this moment, sitting in Mr. Pemberton's office, reading Dad's words together, understanding the full scope of his life's final project, had been planned and anticipated. He knew we'd be here, I said softly. He knew we'd be reading this together. Your father understood something about human nature that took me decades to learn, Mr. Pemberton said. He knew that the most powerful lessons are the ones people have to discover for themselves. He couldn't just tell you what he wanted you to understand. He had to create circumstances that would lead you to those discoveries. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying Dad's final message. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. He set up this entire elaborate plan not to punish me for being absent, but to teach me how to be present going forward. And he honored my sacrifice not by giving me money but by showing me how to transform that sacrifice into service for others, I added, understanding finally dawning. The dollar wasn't an insult, it was a seed. Mr. Pemberton smiled the knowing smile that had become so familiar. Your father often said that the best gifts are the ones that keep giving long after the giver is gone. He wanted to ensure that his love for both of you would continue to create positive change in your community for generations. We sat in silence for a few minutes, letting the full weight of Dad's final lessons settle over us. Outside Mr. Pemberton's window, Millbrook was going about its quiet business, children walking home from school, shop owners sweeping their storefronts, neighbors chatting over garden fences. It was the same town where Dad had lived and worked and raised his family for 40 years. But it would be different now because of what he'd set in motion. "There's one more thing," Mr. Pemberton said, reaching into his desk drawer. "Your father asked me to give you this after you'd read the original will." He handed me a small wrapped package, about the size of a jewelry box. My name was written across the brown paper in Dad's careful handwriting, along with a date from just 6 months before his death, during what I now recognized as one of his final periods of clarity. Inside the wrapping was a simple wooden box, the kind used for storing special keepsakes. When I opened it, I found a single coin, not rare or valuable like the others in the collection, but worn smooth by handling. It was a penny from 1954, the year I was born. Beneath the coin was a tiny folded note. "For Sarah, my daughter, my teacher, my reminder that love is not about what we receive, but about what we give. This penny has been in my pocket every day since you were born. It was there when you took your first steps, when you graduated from college, when you came home to help with your grandfather, when you chose to stay with me at the end. It's worth 1 cent to the world, but it's priceless to me because it represents a lifetime of loving you. Keep it as a reminder that sometimes the smallest things carry the greatest love. Dad." I lifted the coin from the box, feeling its familiar weight, its smoothed edges that spoke of decades of being handled with care. Dad had carried this penny for 42 years, a daily reminder of his daughter, a tangible connection to the love that had shaped both our lives. "He carried this every day," I whispered. "Every single day," Mr. Pemberton confirmed. "He told me it was his good luck charm, but I think it was something more than that. I think it was his way of carrying you with him, even when you were living your own life, even when he couldn't express how proud he was of the woman you'd become." Daniel leaned over to look at the penny, and I saw tears in his eyes. "A lifetime of love in 1 cent, he said softly, "just like the inheritance. A dollar that became $1 million of impact, a penny that represents immeasurable love." As we prepared to leave Mr. Pemberton's office for the final time, I realized that Dad's elaborate plan had accomplished something I'd never expected. It had given me back my brother. The Daniel who hugged me goodbye that afternoon was not the distant, successful lawyer who'd laughed at my inheritance just a month earlier. He was the brother who'd shared my childhood, who'd understood what it meant to lose both parents, who'd learned through Dad's final lesson how to transform regret into purpose. 6 months later, I stood in the community room of Millbrook Elementary School, watching as the first recipients of the Robert Mitchell Memorial Scholarship received their awards. The room was filled with families who understood the weight of financial sacrifice, children whose dreams had almost been deferred by circumstances beyond their control. Among the audience were the first families served by our respite care program, parents who'd been able to attend their children's school events because trained volunteers had provided companionship for their aging family members, caregivers who'd found support and understanding in our monthly meetings. Daniel gave a speech about our father's vision, about the importance of education and community support. Victoria coordinated the logistics with the efficiency of someone who'd found her calling in service to others. Their boys, now 10 years old, helped serve refreshments and told anyone who would listen about their grandfather's coin collection and how every coin told a story of love. But it was the moment when I presented the first scholarship check that I felt Dad's presence most strongly. The recipient was a 16-year-old girl named Maria Santos, whose mother was caring for both her grandmother with dementia and her younger brother with cerebral palsy. Maria's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the scholarship that would allow her to attend community college, while continuing to help support her family. "This changes everything," she whispered to me after the ceremony. "I was going to have to choose between college and staying home to help my mom. Now I can do both." I thought about the choices I'd made at her age, the opportunities I'd given up, the life I'd built through a series of decisions to put family first. But I also thought about the inheritance those choices had earned me. Not just the coins and the trust fund, but the knowledge that love notices everything, that sacrifice matters, that sometimes the greatest wealth comes from giving yourself away. That evening, I sat in Dad's garden, my garden now, holding the 1954 penny he'd carried for 42 years. The tomato plants I'd finally learned to tend were heavy with fruit, and the late summer air was warm with the promise of harvest. In my other hand, I held the framed dollar bill from Dad's will, the dollar that had seemed like such a cruel joke and had become the seed of something beautiful. Together, these two coins represented the full scope of Dad's final gift, proof that he'd carried his love for me through every day of my life, and evidence that even the smallest inheritance can grow beyond imagination when it's planted in gratitude and watered with service to others. The scholarship fund would continue long after I was gone. The respite care program would help families I'd never meet, providing the support that I desperately needed during Dad's illness. The museum exhibit, featuring his coin collection, would teach future generations about the true meaning of inheritance. But sitting in the garden where Dad had taught me that the best things grow slowly, with patience and attention, I understood that his greatest gift wasn't any of those programs. It was the knowledge that love multiplies when it's shared, that the most valuable inheritance is the one that keeps giving, and that sometimes a single dollar, planted in the right soil, tended with the right care, can grow into a legacy that changes the world one family at a time. As the stars came out over Millbrook, I whispered a thank you to the man who taught me that the greatest fortune isn't what you receive, but what you choose to do with what you've been given. His dollar inheritance had become exactly what he'd promised. Not the end of the story, but the beginning of something magnificent. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.